Hey there, everyone. Sorry about that. Minor technical glitch. Can you hear and see me okay? You want to give me a thumbs up? All right, there we go. Sorry about that. Thanks again, and thanks, Lori and Tech Manitoba for having me. Thanks all of you for finding time to come and listen and participate today. You know a little bit about me. In terms of my professional background, I run a very small consulting practice focused on helping organizations support the mental health of their employees through a number of different strategies, but primarily through organizational approaches. And so I'll talk about the difference between sort of the organizational approaches and the individual approaches in a little bit. But my goal for today is really to answer the question, if you are a leader, or if you own a business that's maybe starting up, sort of the call it 50 to 100 people, or even less for that matter. Or I mean, quite frankly, all this applies no matter the size of your business. But if you've seen your team, or even personally you've struggled with mental health challenges over the last year and a half, 2 years, and you're asking yourself the question, how in the world do I get started addressing this within my business? You're in the right place. So that's really what I want to answer for everyone today. Is if this is an entirely new thing for you, if you're not sure where to begin, where can I start? And my goal is to try to make it as pragmatic as possible. And I think we'll recognize in very short order that we don't have to move mountains to make a meaningful difference. So with that first question to all of you, though, I'm curious, and we'll come back to it in a second. If you could describe your current mood today in one word, what would it be? So I'd invite you to throw it in the chat. If you could describe your mood today in one word, what would it be? Hungry. Yeah, okay, fair. Okay, reserved, tired, robotic. I have not heard that one. Drained. Okay, all right. Organized. I'm jealous. I'm very jealous. And there may be a few more coming in. So that's great. I mean, I think the first key message that I'll make as far as it relates to mental health and well-being in the workplace is that the key to all of this is really about bringing the human back to the work environment. And it's something that, for many reasons, a lot of us have kind of lost over the last, say, decade or two. And it's been even more challenging, I'll say, over the last 2 years. But the fundamental thing we want to do is really just recognize that people bring their whole selves to work. And that's, I'd say, the foundation. And part of why I ask you to really reflect on how you're feeling is because all of us are feeling a whole range of different things every day. Every day we come to work or we engage in work. And creating a mentally healthy workplace, first and foremost, starts with acknowledging that we're all at a different place. We're all feeling different things. We're all feeling different experiences. And it's okay to talk about that in the workplace. So that's really the foundation. And I'll come back to this as an exercise in just a little bit. But for now, I'm going to pull up some visuals to help us keep moving. Right, and give me another thumbs up if you can see what I'm sharing with you. Thumbs up. Okay. All right, so guide to getting started. Where do you get started? If you want to support a mentally healthy workplace, what can you do? We're going to talk about a few things today. We're going to talk briefly about what this issue is, why it's an issue, although I think we probably all get that by now. And talk about some common challenges that business owners and leaders face in addressing mental health within their workplace. A few tips for getting started, some practical strategies. I've got 5 for you today. And then a couple of considerations as well for leaders, specifically business leaders, whether you're the CEO, whether you're a manager or director, just some considerations for you in that role as well. So first thing I want to talk about then is really the issue and why it matters. And I think that, if you're here, I'm probably preaching to the choir in that you're interested in this issue. You know that mental health at work matters. It matters for a number of reasons. It matters because if you're in tech, you're likely working in a brain-based economy, in a brain-based role. And the health of your mind, the health of the minds of your employees is absolutely critical to the success of your business. So we know from a ton of research that there is a risk to poor mental health in the workplace. So we know that mental health issues are quite prevalent, but 1 in 5 Canadians every year is going to experience a challenge with their mental health. And we know that mental health issues, even pre-pandemic, are quite costly for businesses. There was a study by Morneau Chappell, now LifeWorks, probably about 5 years ago, and they quantified that cost. It's about $1,500 per employee per year, over and above whatever an employer might be spending on things like benefits for mental health as well. Okay, so it's about $1,500 per employee per year on average, and that rolls up to about $50 billion in the Canadian economy, which is pretty substantial. Uh, but the opportunity in this for employers is although poor mental health in your workplace is costly, we know that addressing mental health and creating a work environment that better supports mental health has a proven ROI. And so, in the first year that an organization takes a proactive approach to addressing mental health in their workplace, it's an average return of about $1.62 on every dollar invested, and that scales over time. We also know that people are more likely to join and stay in a workplace that supports their mental health. And you can see that across any number of national surveys. And when you look at millennials and Gen Z, is that they want a workplace that cares about their mental well-being. And in fact, about 75%, and this is a US stat, but about 75% of Gen Z say that they would, in fact, just simply leave and quit a job if it's adversely affecting their mental health. Okay, so the workforce of the future values this, and that's the opportunity. And especially in an industry like tech, where you're seeing, and especially in Manitoba, Winnipeg, an emergence of great talent, the opportunities to be able to capture and keep that talent if you create the right work environment for them. From a tech perspective specifically, I don't operate in the tech industry. Of course, I'm very interested in understanding it more, but we know that burnout is on the rise. And so this was a survey done actually this year from a company called Blind, which is a platform for, I believe, collaboration and communication within the tech sector used in large companies. About 68% of tech workers felt more burned out than when they did, and they worked in an office pre-pandemic, for example. So burnout's on the rise, and I don't need to tell you that, but just reinforces the fact that, as a business, this is a really important issue to be addressing. Now, we also know though that there are many reasons why, and I've been here as well. There are many reasons why trying to address mental health in your workplace as an employer, as a leader, is challenging. Okay, and these are the top reasons that I often hear in my work with companies. So the first one is always lack of expertise, and it can feel risky, sort of delving into this territory, right? Perhaps, for example, you don't want to open up that Pandora's box, or if somebody tells me that they're really struggling, well, how in the world am I ever going to help them? And so expertise is, or the feeling of a lack of expertise is a challenge. The second one is time, quite frankly. If in the tech sector, I know it's growing rapidly. So if your business is growing, if you're busy, if you're in that perhaps startup or growth stage, time is a valuable commodity, and it continues to be a valuable commodity at many different points in the trajectory of any business. So adding one more thing to the plate can feel a little bit overwhelming, but what I'll show you is that actually it's more about doing things differently than doing new things. Okay, money is another one. Paying attention to the bottom line, but we know from research in Canada and abroad, there's a return on investment for addressing mental health. And in fact, I'm going to talk about a lot of ways that you can support mental health within the workplace that are in fact completely free. And then interest is another one, and there's a bit of I guess a sentiment sometimes that, I don't want to talk about my feelings because talking about feelings is tough, and it's messy, and it's icky, and it's gross, and that doesn't sound like fun in the workplace. And again, what I want to say is that talking about and supporting mental health does not need to be about opening up all of the messy feelings that we're all feeling, although that can be helpful in some ways. But all that to say, you don't need to become a counselor, and you don't need to be listening your job is not to listen as a counselor every time somebody is struggling. And so we'll break that down in a little bit more detail. But all I want to say here is that these are very common challenges. And so if these are things that you're feeling as we delve into this issue, know that you're not alone. And know that what I'm going to talk about kind of presents solutions to all of these common challenges. So you can, in fact, get started, and I'm here to make it a little bit easier for you. So the next thing I want to talk about before I get into the practical strategies here is really the difference between employee-focused strategies and employer-focused strategies. Okay, so I talk to a lot of employers, and when they start along their journey of addressing and supporting mental health in the workplace, the common things that an employer will look at is to say, well, can I provide some resilience training, or can I provide a mindfulness app for my employees, for example, with the goal of giving employees skills, knowledge, tools in their toolbox to help them look after their own mental health and well-being. Okay, and that's where a lot of employers start, is those employee-focused strategies. So what can I give to my employees to equip them and give them another tool in their toolbox? Okay, and that's not inherently a bad thing. But the analogy I like to use is that those sort of employee-focused strategies are kind of like, if I can make the parallel to the construction industry, giving someone a hard hat. Okay, and I'm talking at Tech Manitoba, so I'm not afraid of offending anyone in the construction industry here. But if you give employees hard hats, that's great. They need to have them. There's hazards in a construction site that they need to be protected from, right? That's the equivalent of resilience training. That's the equivalent of a mindfulness app, for example. Okay. But if, as an employer or as a foreman on a construction site, you're standing on the third story and you continue to throw bricks at people's heads, quite frankly, it doesn't matter how great a hard hat you've given them, it's still going to break and they're still going to get hurt. And so that's the difference between employee and employer-focused strategies. So employer-focused strategies are ones that, in fact, tackle the root causes of work stress and of work-related mental health issues at that organizational level. Talks about policy, talks about process, talks about systems to support your people, talks about leadership practices, right? And we know that actually those are the things that can, in fact, cause risk to an employee's mental health. Okay, so not to say that you don't need to give employees hard hats. Absolutely, we do, but we also need to look at the bricks that we might be throwing at employees' heads, and hopefully stop throwing bricks. Okay, so that's the difference between employee-focused and employer-focused. And when I'm working with an employer, I always want to try to have them do a bit of both. Okay, because there's a role for each of them. And so the strategies I'm going to talk about next kind of cover off both of those, and we've got a good mix here. So in terms of how do you get started, okay, so if you're sitting there saying, I'd like to make that intention to support mental health in my organization in the new year, what can I actually do to get that moving in a concrete way? And there's 5 things I'm going to talk about: normalize conversations, build skills, provide support, workload, and balance. So let's get into those, and then of course, any questions you have along the way, please feel free. So I think the best way that I can make sure that we're giving you the information you want today is for you to let me know when you have questions. So throw them in the chat, throw them in the Q&A, and I'm happy to take them as we go. Okay, so the first concrete thing you can do to get started supporting mental health in your workplace in the new year is, quite frankly, to normalize conversations about it. So that little exercise I asked you to do at the front end of our time together, how are you feeling today, is a very simple strategy to help bring people's awareness to the fact that we all have internal stuff going on, and we're all being impacted by in different ways by everything that's going on in our lives, both at work and outside of work. Okay. Stigma is, in fact, one of the most common reason people choose not to get help when they're experiencing a challenge with their mental health. And we know that the only way to actually reduce stigma is to simply talk, start conversations and share stories, right? And that's, that we think about Bell Let's Talk Day as an example. That's the impetus underneath it, is that in fact the only way we reduce stigma, encourage people to get help, encourage people to do what they need to do to feel better, is to start talking about it. So how can you normalize conversations about mental health in a workplace in a way that feels appropriate? Okay, so first thing I always say for every leader, every manager, is to find some way to have a check-in with your team every time you get together in any sort of team meeting. Okay, so whether it's how are you feeling today, or give me a number from 1 to 10, give me a thumbs up, thumbs down, your favorite emoji, whatever it might be. Find some way to regularly check in on the internal state of your employees and your team members. That's one great way to help normalize that type of conversation. It says it's okay if I'm having a bad day today, or hey, it's okay if I'm having a bad week, and it helps people feel more comfortable sharing, which in turn helps people feel more comfortable offering help and receiving it. Okay. Second tip would be around language. Language matters. So if we're going to normalize conversations about mental health in the workplace, we also need to normalize respectful, stigma-free language about mental health. So you can do this by being conscious about how and when, and avoiding using words like crazy or depressed, for example, right? So using these words minimize the experience of somebody who might be struggling with their mental health. And then finally, third way to help normalize these conversations is to share stories. So I often talk to leaders, and the way they sort of kick off addressing mental health in their workplaces, if they've had a mental health challenge themselves, they're vulnerable first and they share it with their team members, with their employees. But they don't just talk about the struggle, they talk about what they did to start feeling better. And that's in fact the best way to share that kind of a story. So that's the first tip, and hopefully that's fairly concrete, is normalize conversations about mental health. And there's a bunch of different ways you can do it, but get a pulse check, be careful with your language, and then share stories. The second way that you can get started in terms of addressing mental health at work is to build knowledge and skills, but specifically for leaders. Okay, so if you're a leader, or if you have managers within your company, whatever the case may be, they need to have the right skills and knowledge to do a number of things. But number one is to recognize when an employee might be struggling with their mental health, and then two, to be able to respond in a meaningful, appropriate way and have a conversation with them about it and offer some support. And it turns out that if we look at, when I talked about return on investment, looked at what drives return on investment, it's actually this more than any other factor. It's the training and development of leaders. And so there was a question in the chat, actually, what does a leader do if you check in with staff in a meeting and some of them say they're not okay? And so this is exactly my point. And when we talk about the skills and knowledge leaders need to have, that's exactly what we want to equip them with. Okay, so often, and maybe I would switch the order, but this training and skill and knowledge for leaders often comes as the first step, so that it enables them to feel more comfortable once you've opened up those conversations. Okay, so a great little tip, or little framework that I like, is from the Movember Foundation. And so in general, if somebody's talking to you and they're struggling with their mental health, remember ALEC. Okay, so ask questions about their experience, listen without needing to provide solutions, encourage action, meaning encouraging them to take action and find help, and then check in with them again. And that's a basic framework for how leaders can have that kind of a conversation. There's many more others, and there's a bunch of training, of course, that can help. So mental health first aid or the Working Mind are two ultra low cost programs that are available across Canada that can actually give managers, leaders, some of those really practical tools. So to give you an example, mental health first aid is about $150. Okay, so it's really actually quite affordable. So that cost argument tends to go down when we take a look at what's actually there and what it really costs, and it's not that much. So third, provide support for mental health issues. And so my key takeaway here, any size of employer, you want to ensure that every employee has the ability to access some form of mental health support when or if they need it. Okay. And so many employers, this will be an employee assistance program, this will be benefits, for example. But if you're a smaller employer, that gets really hard. Okay. So there's actually, if it's not, if you're not at the point where you're able to provide those supports for your employees, then it's just a matter of understanding what's available for them for free, provided through our public healthcare system, and being able to direct them to it, and allow them to understand what's there for them. So in particular, even in Manitoba, for example, if you're looking for free resources, we've got Ability CBT by LifeWorks, for example. We've got Bounce Back by the Canadian Mental Health Association. These are completely 100% free. Okay. So again, cost not an issue, and if you need if you're trying to ensure that you've got support for your employees, it's often a matter of ensuring that they know how to access the support that's already there for them. Okay, so if you're a larger employer and you're trying to think about, well, what do I need to provide in terms of that support for employees who are struggling, uh, there's so many solutions out there, more than I could probably name. But my tips in terms of where to focus would be focus on accessibility first and foremost. We know that virtual solutions provide incredibly high value. So things like teletherapy, for example. And also take a look, if you're a small business, at things like group or association discounts. So I know if you're a member of the Manitoba Chamber of Commerce, for example, there's a Chamber's plan. You might be able to score some discounts that way. Right? So try to maximize the value that you're spending, but focus on accessibility first. That would be my key recommendation there. Okay. Fourth tip. And now we're moving away from kind of the individual tools. We're moving away from the hard hats, and we're moving more towards the bricks. Okay. So at the organizational level, one thing that employers need to be really conscious of is workload. And this is something that we're all quite used to talking about. We all have a lot of work to do. It never seems to change. And in fact, we know that workload is one of the biggest factors when it comes to adversely impacting employee mental health. Okay, there's a ton of research around it, but the long and short is that if you have a lot of work to do and very little control over how that work gets done, you're at an incredibly high risk for stress related injuries or illnesses. Okay, so key for you as perhaps a business owner or a leader or even a manager is to be ultra tuned in to how your team is experiencing the workload that they currently have on their plate, and rebalancing it frequently. Okay, so I have one friend in this space who talks about it as who needs the cooling suit this week, for example. And I don't know where he got that from, but it seems to be a fairly fitting analogy, right? So who's running too hot, and who needs a bit of cool down this week, or how can we rebalance things so that someone who's been running hot for 3 weeks has a little bit more help, a little bit more support. And so this can be done in very informal ways, often something that needs a leader to do and to engage in. So have that conversation regularly with your teams to say, what's your workload like, and how long have you been running hot, so to speak. Okay, make an effort to shift that work and rebalance it whenever possible, or also think about, how do we balance the ledger after a period of high demand? That's another thing you can think about. And we'll get to that in actually just a second. And then the other thing to think about from a workload perspective is, if you can't fundamentally change the workload, change the amount of control somebody has over how they get the work done. Okay, so there's a little model here on the screen, and it sort of talks about what I've been saying, is that high demand and low control is a recipe for job stress and ultimately poor mental health. But the one other mediating factor there is support. And so if we have a supportive manager, a supportive leader, a supportive supervisor that understands, that provides empathy, for example, that actively listens to us when we're feeling stressed, that also mitigates the effect of high workload as well. Okay, so further reinforces the importance of training leaders, because in situations where you can't change the demand and you can't change control, ensuring that your leaders are supportive and practicing empathy is one of the ways to then help reduce the negative impact of high workload. Okay. So monitor workload, the fourth easy way to get started. And again, it doesn't have to be complicated. It's simply asking the question, who's running too hot this week? Okay. And then making changes accordingly. And then the last strategy that you can use to get started, if you're trying to figure out what this looks like for you and your business, is to encourage balance simply for what matters most. Okay, and this can feel tough. And so, I've been there myself many times, and I've worked in the nonprofit sector, which is I would say characteristically overworked and understaffed, and it can be really hard to find that balance. But we know fundamentally that allowing employees time to focus on other aspects of their life outside of work is going to make them feel healthier, more engaged, and more productive when they come back. So as an employer, then how do you get started here and how can you do this? Well, first and foremost, if you're a small business, if you're a growing business, it's a good opportunity to review your policies around leave and time away from work. Okay. So certainly first and foremost, make sure you're doing the minimum, make sure you've got the minimum outlined and ideally outlined in policy. And then ask yourself the question, what else could I do? Where else could I give people time, flexibility to prioritize what matters most to them in their lives? Things like family, for example. Things like physical activity, for example. So a lot of companies, might provide a wellness benefit. They might cover a gym membership. They might allow a flex schedule, whatever that looks like. Make sure you're meeting the minimum, and then see what else you can do to either give your employees more time away from work, or give them more flexibility in how, when, and where their work gets done. Another really simple thing that you can do is to really just institute a policy of disconnection. And we're seeing this in Ontario right now in law. We're seeing it in the federal government as well, is that is they're trying to encourage employers to consider that employees should have a right to and the ability to disconnect from their work when they're not working. So something for you to think about is how could you institute that kind of disconnection? So when you're on holiday or when you're done for the day, how is it, or how could you make sure that if you're an employee, that your manager, your boss isn't emailing you, isn't calling you, isn't expecting a response from you. And so encourage employees to actually disconnect, whether that's through policy or whether that's through changes to how your teams operate from a cultural perspective. Encourage them to disconnect when they're not supposed to be working and when they're not working. And then really, as a leader, it's about avoiding the temptation to lure them back in, because it's really easy to be tempted to lure someone back in to answer one question, to take one phone call. But that really disrupts a lot of the benefits that they get from, in fact, disconnecting from work. And then the final tip, really concretely, quite honestly, take vacation. And if you're a leader, role model it, and role model time away as the norm. And even then, it can still be difficult. So what I've seen employers do that you might consider is provide some way to actually incentivize vacation. Okay, so a couple of years ago, there's an article actually about a startup, and what they did, their whole pitch, their whole product was about providing employers with a fund that they could contribute to that would then be put towards employee vacation, for example. So the platform was called Vacation Fund, actually. And so essentially, employers would contribute to this vacation fund, employees could match it, and they would have access to that to fund whatever they wanted to do on their vacation. Okay. And now I'm not saying you need to do that, but how could you incentivize vacation or make vacation a little bit more tangible, right? Especially now in the age of virtual work, what could you do? I mean, maybe it's a gift card to a local restaurant. Say, hey, I want you to take some time off, and while you're taking time off, here, go to dinner with your spouse, with your partner, with your kids, whatever it might be. But if you can find a way to incentivize vacation, make it more desirable for employees to actually be away and use that time, consider doing it. So 5 tips, 5 ways you can get started. And now what I want to just talk about very briefly before we open it back up for questions is just a few tactics and tips for leaders. So if you're a leader, a couple things that I think are really important. And again, it's not about becoming a therapist or a counselor. It's about making small changes in the way you operate and your own management practices by and large. But the first thing I'd say is support, don't solve. So there was a question before about how do you support someone, or what do you do if somebody says, "Hey, I'm not okay right now," and the key here is to provide support, to listen, to encourage them to connect to resources, but it's ultimately not to solve the problem for them. Okay, you're supposed to be a supportive person in their life, and you're most useful when you're a connector. So encourage employees to connect to the types of supports, the types of resources that they need to look after their own mental health. Second tip here, tone from the top. It's interesting that when asked, and again, there's a survey data to describe this, but employees, generally speaking, want the discussion about mental health to originate from their leaders. And again, it speaks to issues of stigma. But if you want to change the dialogue around mental health in your workplace and you're a leader in your company, it's got to start with you. So be the first one to be vulnerable. Be the first one to talk about it when you're feeling stressed. Be the first one to talk about the things that you might be doing to look after your health or wellness, for example. Role model those types of conversations and the respectful tone with which we should be talking about our mental health and well-being. And ideally, that will help employees feel more comfortable as well. Enable flexibility. And I think, again, most of us are well attuned to this, but losing flexibility, interestingly enough, is actually one of the biggest fears employees have post-pandemic. So we've become quite accustomed to it. And in fact, when we think about returning to a workplace, to a physical work environment, the biggest fear employees have is losing that flexibility. And that causes a lot of stress. So the more you can enable flexibility within your team, the likelier they are to feel good about work and to feel good about their health. And then finally, I think this has probably resonated throughout, but as a leader, role model behaviors, particularly when it comes to language related to mental health and mental health issues, and particularly when it relates to balance and disconnection from work. If you want your team to do it and you're not doing it, you're not likely to have a lot of success. Okay, so role model the habits that you want your team to have, and it's got to start with you. So, I'm going to stop there. It's been a fair bit to unpack, and I want to leave time for discussion and any questions you might have, but information there if you want to connect further, and would love to continue the conversation. So thanks. And Lori, I see you've popped on, so that means my time is up.
Thank you. That was just so helpful. Like there was so much information packed into that short little bit of space, and you're so articulate. So thanks for that. I actually have a couple of questions for you. So I'll maybe get things started, and then I just encourage all of our audience to use the Q&A or just pop a question into the chat so that we can get to your specific questions. When you did the check-in at the start of the event, one person said they felt that they were being undervalued.
Yes.
And that I was interested in that comment in terms of what's your thoughts on how feeling undervalued contributes to mental stress. And I'm interested in, so that part A, and then what's the leader role, in the role of the leader possibly in an employee who may feel undervalued, but also is there a role for colleagues?
Oh, that's a great question. And so what we know in terms of when employees feel undervalued, it puts them at a high risk for burnout. We know that to be quite true. And of course, it means that employees are much less likely to stay. So from a leadership perspective, and I'll think about maybe even a step further to start, employees often feel undervalued, and I can't speak for every employee, but we know that employees often feel undervalued when the reward and recognition they're receiving for their work is out of line with how much they're working. And so I think as a company, you should look very carefully at things like compensation. You should look very carefully at things like reward and recognition programs, because when people feel unrecognized and unrewarded for their work, they feel undervalued, quite simply put. From a leadership perspective, I think some of this can come down to alignment of skills, interests, purpose, and values as well. So sometimes we can feel undervalued if we're doing work that is not meaningful to us, or we're not entirely sure what the meaning of the work is, right? And so as a leader, there's a couple things then. One, think about your employees, and are they getting a chance, even if perhaps each of us are doing work that we don't want to do. Do they have the chance to do work that provides them with meaning and purpose? um, and if they're not finding that, help them find it. Okay. And that's where a lot of that flexibility comes in. And then from employees and colleagues, that's a great question. In my experience, if we're feeling undervalued at work, it often has less to do with employees and colleagues, and it has more to do with how the organization and our leaders are engaging with us and how they're treating us. So, as a colleague, certainly, reward and recognition doesn't have to come from the top; it can come from all sides. So get into the habit. I think it's good practice in any team to be identifying the wins and providing recognition and those virtual high fives for people when they're working hard and getting good work done. Certainly make that a norm. But I do think the underlying issue is feeling undervalued happens when an employer based on how an employer is treating an employee.
Mm-hmm. Before we get to the question, the next question, I just want to remind people that we will put a link. Jordan's generously agreed to share the slides with us, so we will put that in the link in a minute in the chat. But here's a question from the audience. What do you do when an employee is resistant to admitting that they have a mental health issue or getting help with it?
That's a great question. Probably one of the most common questions I get asked, and so there's so many different aspects to this to maybe unpack. But first and foremost, I always ask them the question: why do you think they're resistant? Why do you think they're resistant? Okay, some of it might come internally, certainly, but I think there's something to be said for looking at the work environment that's been created and what stigma might exist in that environment. Now, that doesn't necessarily help in that immediate situation, but always something to think about when you have an employee that is clearly struggling but does not want to talk about it, is what's going on in the workplace, in the work environment, that's making them resistant to having that conversation. Okay. Often comes back to fear, often comes back to stigma, fear of losing advancement, fear of losing opportunities in their career, all those sorts of things that are really sort of cultural things that need to change. But my best advice for someone who's in this position is, number one, say what you see. Okay. So talk about what you're noticing, what makes you think somebody is struggling, and talk about it in objective behavioral based terms. Okay. So relate it back to performance on their job, and very concrete. The more concrete you can get, the better. That often helps perhaps build insight, and if insight is something they're lacking. And then I would say the other thing that I often talk about is that, quite frankly, our health information is our own. Right. So if I'm an employee and I'm struggling, quite frankly, I don't want to talk to my manager about what's going on. I do not have to. Okay. But as a manager, as a leader, you do and you should, you do need to and you should keep the door open for that conversation. Okay. So what that means in the short term is that you might approach somebody who's struggling using a more traditional performance management lens to say, hey, look, here's the behavior at work. This is what needs to change. How can I help you do that? Okay. And that's okay. but keep the door open to a conversation about it from a well-being or mental health perspective. To say, if you ever want to talk to me about what's going on, or if you're ever feeling like your well-being or your mental health or your any aspect of your health is causing you difficulties at work, please know that you can have that conversation with me, and I'm here to listen and support you. Okay, so keep the door open would be my second best piece of advice there.
Yeah, that's great advice. I think Robert's got a really good question that he's added into the chat, and saying there's a whole strategy for this, no doubt. But can you speak to what should be done when an employee comes back from a stress leave?
I can, but first I'll speak to what should happen when an employee goes on stress leave.
Okay, perfect.
Because that's most important.
Yeah.
When an employee goes on stress leave, and there's often this sort of assumption that if somebody's away on stress leave, oh, I better not bother them. I better leave them alone. Okay. And in fact, what we know about individuals who have to leave work for a period of time due to stress or due to a mental illness is that best practice is to actually stay in touch with them. Okay. And it's not to say you need to talk to them about work, but even from a manager, leader, HR perspective, even saying, hey, how's it going? Happy holidays. Here's a picture of us at our holiday party, things like that. If they're receptive to it, keep that line of communication open. Something interesting that happens when someone goes on stress leave, all that communication ceases. But if someone were to say, for example, be taking time off work to get chemotherapy, they would be receiving an outpouring of support from everybody in their team. Okay. And so we want to parallel that approach. When someone goes on stress leave, it's because they need time away to deal with an aspect of their health that needs attention. And so we should be providing that kind of support and communication to let them know, not that, hey, there's a bunch of work for you here when you get back, but hey, we hope you're well. We're thinking about you. Can't wait to see you again. Right. So that approach needs to start when they go out of the workplace, and then when they come back to the workplace, there's a whole bunch we could talk about, but I think the key is managing messaging. So as an employer or leader, maybe a human resources professional, is just simply have a conversation with his employee to say, look, there are people that are going to ask you questions about why you are off, about how you're doing now. And there are people that are going to ask me about it as a manager, leader, HR personnel. What should we say? What do you want to say? What do you want that narrative to be? What do you want me to tell people? And give them a little bit of control over some of the messaging that's delivered either to the team or to the company when they return, because it can often feel like a situation that they have very little control over. So one tip there, out of probably many I could talk about, is involve that employee as they're coming back and allow them to control a bit of that narrative and own what the message is that other employees on the team hear about why they were away and now they're coming back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
hopefully, Robert, that's helpful, and I'm happy to elaborate if you want about anything.
And speaking of elaborating, if any of you have future questions, we're also going to drop a link into the chat so that you know how to connect with Jordan, because this was super helpful. Actually, I think it was the perfect ending to our Tech Mashup season. We do want to give you all a few minutes for networking before we shut things down. But before we do that, I just want to share with you 4 upcoming events. Actually, before I do that, Jordan, thank you so much. This really,
no problem,
really was helpful.
You betcha.
So tomorrow we have another free workshop, and it's about the vanishing employee. And this is interesting. We did a survey of Manitobans, and I have to tell you, there are a lot of people who are thinking of leaving their job in the next 6 months, and a lot of people who have left their job in the previous 6 months. So if your recruitment team is doing an amazing job of hiring, trust me, they are leaking out the back door, because there's an issue around retention in our community. Not in our community. This is happening across North America right now. So please sign up for the Vanishing Employee, because there's some really great tips about how to create a culture that gets people to want to stay. And in fact, a lot of things that you learned today are going to be echoed in some of the information that we share with you tomorrow. So there's still room. Sign up. There's a link in the chat. January 14th is our next tech mashup when we come back in January. And it's about reimagining the workspace, but this is super cool. This is Traction on Demand that's going to be joining us. They've taken remote work to a whole new space. They've actually gone out into little cafes in rural areas and set up workspaces there. And they're sort of supporting businesses in small areas. They're creating workspaces in weird public spaces. It's just a great concept. And I think you guys will really enjoy hearing what Traction on Demand is up to. And they're still on a massive hiring surge in Winnipeg, specifically in Manitoba. So they're going to be interesting to hear about. And then one thing we don't want you to miss is another free event, which is the Manitoba Women in Tech event coming up on January 19th. And it's going to be about how do you move forward in your career in tech. And it's super interesting. We've actually got five different people from Skip the Dishes, one who's responsible for onboarding and career pathing, and others who have joined the organization in tech and have found really interesting, meaningful work in all areas of the organization. How do you advocate for yourself? And how do you as an employee make sure that you don't lose amazing staff because you're continuing supporting them in their advancement? And then last but not least, for any of you who are involved in small business, we really would love you to come and join us at the Manitoba Tech Trade Expo, which is on January 11th. And what we're doing is we're bringing our member directory to life, where you can come and speak to people like, I see Ron Cantaveris is in our audience, because you can learn about training, you can learn about recruiting, consultation around technologies, how to really optimize some of your efficiencies at work. So please do join us again. The link is in the chat. Now let me just double check if there was a, did we address everything that needed addressing? Oh yeah, share the vanishing employee. I think we did. I think that link is up there now. And I think that's it. I think we could just let you go back to networking. I will not push any more buttons because I messed up the first time when I said hello, but go back and say hello before you head back to your work. And please have very, very happy holidays. We appreciate you coming out and coming to these events and networking with each other. That's really what we love to do. We really live up to our name in terms of building connections. So happy holidays to everyone from all of us at Tech Manitoba.